Hi, I'm Katherine Anderson, reporting for Daily Bulletin. I'm talking with Dr. Rodney Haring from Roswell Park Comprehensive Cancer Center in Buffalo, New York. Dr. Haring is sharing key learnings from the RSNA 2025 session, Radiologic Sovereignty, Indigenous Innovation, Access, and the Future of Imaging Science to Address Health Disparities. Thank you for joining me today.
Yes, of course. Thank you for having me.
Dr. Haring, your course emphasizes the importance of ethical principles and cultural awareness when conducting health equity research in Native American communities. Can you explain how tribal institutional review boards and tribal sovereignty shape the research process and why these safeguards are essential?
The conversations around research, the ethical practices of research with Native nations or tribes is really important because the history of research hasn't always been on the beneficial side to Native people or Native tribes. Native Americans are not only a racial or ethnic category in the United States, but we're a political classification, and our native nations, just like any other country in the world. So we're nations within the United States context. And as such, we have our own governance type of overview, oversights over research. And many tribes do have their own tribal institutional review board and or a form of that that's often a governance council, whether it be a health board, a health committee, tribal council, governors, chiefs, presidents of the Native nations that oversee and get review and tribal resolution to be partner to research. And why is that important? It's important because of we tribes have to be part of that research process. They have to instill the ethical practices that may be different than other non-nation, non-native type research paradigms or process, and that it's really important for the community and the tribal governments to be, guiding the research to make sure that it's not only relevant to the community, but it's culturally safe for the community, and that the community is involved to provide evidence that is relevant for Native nations and Native peoples.
Yeah, of course. And can you tell me, what does effective community engagement actually look like in practice? And how does it influence the design, implementation, and sharing of research findings?
Community outreach and engagement is really important to communication, whether it be initiating and developing and co-creating materials that are culturally relevant to the tribal nations and Native nations. Um, I think the most important thing is to think about, you know, many universities, cancer centers, and other institutions may have an outreach and engagement type process, but it is different for tribes and Native nations because again, we are nations of the United States and have different engagement patterns, different approvals to allow types of engagement in our communities. So it's really important for universities, centers, and institutions, organizations to really understand those nuances of how to work in a government to government to institutional type or engagement patterns. And by doing so, it enhances the trust and relationship building between the institution, whether it be research, clinical practice, or other. But it also in the dissemination of materials when you have an outreach team that provides information from the community by the community, it really can make an impactful difference.
Mhm. And your work also examines both the historical and ongoing factors, such as colonization, forced relocation, and cultural erasure, that's all contributed to health disparities in American Indian and Alaska Native communities. So, can you tell me what key lessons have emerged from successful case studies, and how can these approaches be applied to improve imaging equity in other settings?
It's really important to understand our history. And if you look at the history of Native nations and the United States, and the history of Native nations in Canada, the history of Native nations in other countries that have Indigenous, and all countries have Indigenous populations, what is that history and what does it mean to our people today? And it isn't, it is, for many, if not all Native nations, it's been a challenging history. But the really important part is now is the time to understand that history. Now is the time to build resiliency and platforms and embrace our indigenous knowledges and the knowledges that have kept our ancestors and good health. The survivorship of our people is really important. And we have that. Many Native nations have a philosophy of the seventh generation. And what does that mean? That means that the things that we do now, the processes that we put in place for the here and now, it isn't really is for the here and now. It isn't even for the next generations, but it's for 7 generations forward. And how we formalize platforms around radiology and clinical trials and imaging and research in general, 7 generations forward. And that's how we sustain ourselves as people, to really have that thought and mindset. So although there have been the history of boarding schools where we weren't allowed to speak our language, we weren't allowed to practice our ancestral ways of life, now is the time to re-embrace that and incorporate into our process of radiologic care, our process of research and surgery, and our process of the health and wellness for our peoples.
Oh, yeah, such great information. And I really appreciate you taking your time today. For more information about the study, look for this RSNA 2025 session on demand at rsna.org/meeting central. And as always, you can find more radiology news at rsna.org/bulletin.
Thank you.